Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor John Henning, and I'm an oncologist. And for the last 10 years, I've been involved in large-scale clinical trials focused on hematologic malignancies. We've had some remarkable results and real breakthroughs in treatment options for patients. I believe as a clinician, sometimes we get so heavily focused on the outcomes of these trials and the clinical data that the patient experience gets somewhat overlooked. Well, today, I'm delighted to say we have the opportunity to rebalance and hear from a patient about their experiences of taking part in a clinical trial. Jack Whelan was diagnosed in 2007 with a rare form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Subsequently, he has become a patient advocate and speaks to audiences around the world about his story of survival. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to introduce Mr. Jack Whelan.
Boy, with an introduction like that, that's tough. Great. Very good, John.
Well, thank you very much for coming along today, Jack. Jack, before we talk directly about your clinical trial experiences, I would like to take you back to the first moment when you were diagnosed with cancer. I mean, how did you feel?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the topic of cancer will sooner or later come up at everyone's breakfast table. We don't expect it, but imagine being in a situation where you're told you have a rare, incurable cancer. And you know, it's a scary scenario. The first thing that came to mind is, how much time do I have? So I think all of us would face that question. And then the word incurable, what do you mean by incurable? You know, what's science working on? There's got to be a solution. So it's a scary scenario.
What was the effect on your family?
Well, my wife and 3 daughters, of course, you know, went to the web and looked up this word, this lymphoplasmacytic lymphoma, and they, you know, looked at the conclusions. And much of what was on the web is retrospective. It's really, what is the historical outcome? And the historical outcome was essentially 5 years after diagnosis, or 5 years after beginning treatment. So, you know, you wonder, well, how long have you been symptomatic? How long has this been underway? And so the clock starts ticking when you go to the web. But I caution everyone, what you see on the web is historical. It's what has happened in the past. So that was key, to get to the family and say, hey, you know, things are going to be okay going forward.
When you heard that your cancer was incurable, I mean, how did that feel?
How would you feel? I mean, it's the word incurable is a very scary word. And, you know, what I thought about really was describing it as not yet curable. I mean, all of these diseases, whether they are rare or common, ultimately will be cured. It's a question of time. When is it going to be cured?
Later, you decided to take part in a clinical trial. I mean, tell us about that, please.
When, you know, the historical outcome, as I said, for this type of cancer, you know, was limited. And because it's rare and it's a blood cancer, we borrow chemotherapies from chronic lymphocytic leukemia, from lymphoma, and from myeloma. So it's a cancer of the bone marrow. So it's some of the therapeutics used in myeloma treatment are used in this. It's also a cancer that's in the lymphatic system. So we borrow drugs from lymphoma regimens. And also it's in the blood system. Looks very similar to chronic lymphocytic leukemia in some ways. So this whole idea of borrowing from other cancers using sort of an empirical approach just didn't make sense. I kind of liked what was behind door number 3. Even though I couldn't see what was there, it just seemed betting on forward-looking science made more sense to me, rather than knowing what the outcome would be from a history. Yeah.
And it's obvious that there seems to be a number of areas where the scientific community can improve its engagement with patients, you know, and also promote the life of the use of clinical trials, you know, as a treatment option for more people who are facing terminal diagnosis. But Jack, what about the future?
Yeah. Well, first of all, John, we're all terminal. There's no question about that. But looking at clinical trials in the future, I really do I see progress. And I don't come from this industry. I have a unique advantage. I'm sort of looking in from a window from outside. And the whole idea of targeted therapy, the road to personalized medicine, I think is the best promise and the best hope. The ability to identify what causes, in this case, what causes cancer. What's the DNA misspelling? What's the translocation that causes this? So I think the future's pretty bright, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the presentation on where we are today and where we're likely to be in the near term.
Well, we all look forward to hearing that, Jack.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much.
Let's get it on. Okay, you know, the best presentation I think I ever gave was about 25, 30 years ago as a young computer salesman. I went to London with a carousel of 35 millimeter slides. And the slide projectors in England were very different than in the US. The US, they had a low voltage light bulb, and we used these plastic acetate slides. So when you put the slide in front of the light bulb from the US, after about 15 seconds, the light bulb would start to burn the slide. So what would happen, it would come out of focus after about 15 seconds. And I learned that by the second slide because the third slide had started to melt. And what I learned more importantly was that if you flip through slides really fast, the audience appreciates it. So I'm not going to hit you with a lot of bullets. So, you know, when it was done, it was like maybe 15 or 20 slides done in 15 seconds over a period of, you know. So I found that, especially speaking to an audience where there's multiple languages, put a lot of words on there, but I'm not going to read the words, or I'm not going to kill you with bullets. But I'd like to start with the first question. How many people here have ever ridden on a roller coaster? Can I have a show of hands? Pretty much everybody, you know. And you know the feeling when you're on a roller coaster, you're going up, that clicking sound, and you're anticipating what's going to happen. And then as you get to the top, you kind of look down, and, you know, in a matter of seconds, you're going down high speed. You know, you feel like your stomach is going to come out. Your blood pressure rises, your temperature rises, and it really scares the hell out of you. And well, that's kind of what the feeling is when you're told you have blood cancer and it's incurable. This scared feeling, you know, where am I going to go from there? So I just want you to imagine if you're in that situation, how you would feel about that. So here's the situation. You've got blood cancer. It's rare, and again, the words they were using was incurable. I say it's not yet curable. There's no radiation, no surgery, no known chemotherapy. But the good news, it's indolent. It's slow moving. You've got about 5 years. The problem with indolent cancers is that they don't respond to therapy very quickly. They respond kind of slowly and often require therapy over a long period of time, which is one of the downsides. So I'd ask you the question, what would you do? And I decided to become this, quote, ePatient. And you're probably familiar with the term, the ePatient. It's sort of a new generation of educated, you know, online empowered patients. And more patients are becoming active in their care and making decisions. And I think everyone here would too. Most of the people in this audience come from science. You know, it's probably the best audience for me to talk to because I love what you guys do, and it's a very noble profession that you've chosen. You don't hear that enough from patients because we're disconnected. We don't get to talk to each other very often. So this whole evolution of ePatients, I think, is going to be important. So the goals for this presentation, real quickly, is to give you my patient story. I'll do that fast, some observations and why I'm optimistic, and then the impact of some of the key questions that Emma asked me to talk about, the impact of the heavily regulated environment, how to encourage more clinical trial participation, and really to facilitate direct engagement with participants. By the way, I think Emma and Jessica, the whole team from Informa, you guys have done a great job. I asked her earlier, is this like being a wedding planner? You know, when you have to get everybody together in the same room. But in the final part is maybe pass some information that could save your life. So anyway, I'd like to start off and quote that great American philosopher, Forrest Gump. And Forrest Gump said, advocates, if you sort of a paraphrase, advocates are like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. We advocates, we're sometimes vocal, we're very active in healthcare social media. We may crash your event if we're not invited. Some of them are mad and misinformed. I describe them as enraged cyberchondriacs. They focus on what's wrong. And that's some collection of advocates. I think they're not effective advocates. It's important that we remember, though, advocates or patient advocates are really no more effective than the man on the street except for their experiences. Sometimes they'll come into your group with this can of gas and a flame and say, I want to talk to you, which is a problem, as you know. I chose a different path, and that is to become an ePatient advocate. And the path was to learn as much as I could about this cancer. So I started attending conferences, and I think I've got about $100,000 worth of education if you added up these $3,000 fees that you would normally be required to pay to attend. But I found if you spoke at the conference, you can get in free and you can talk to an audience directly. So, then I started presenting posters and sort of defending my message at places like American Society of Clinical Oncology. And this is where you post your message in front of a bunch of physicians, and they can beat you up and say, well, you know, you're full of it or not. But the ability to defend what you think is important. The other part is moving really from adversity to advocacy. And by getting involved in legislative advocacy, it was important. The key message here is all of us, everyone here, we want to become old people. That's really what the goal is. So I really believe that laughter is the best medicine. I think for years, Reader's Digest used to have this section I thought was particularly funny. But it really is. Laughter has a lot to do with being the best medicine. Anytime I received chemotherapy, and I'm in treatment right now, I get chemo every Friday and Saturday. I'm not happy about the one I'm on. It's sort of an old school drug that's been around for a long time, and it's infusion-based rather than pill form. So it takes a lot of time. It's typically 4 or 5 hours on Friday and then another 2 hours on Saturday. But sitting in the infusion room is kind of a boring place. So I used to, and still do, hang a bottle of Guinness on my infusion rack. And that really brings a lot of laugh, and it kind of helps me deal with the fear. Also, I'd use it in a process called plasmapheresis, where they filter out your blood. And people, you know, at this hospital had never run into a patient that would do that. But I think the laughter is a medicine is important. Now, this is something you can read high speed, and it's in the presentation. It's like, well, who is this guy, and why is he here today? Just from a personal standpoint, I'm married. My wife and I just celebrated a 45th wedding anniversary a couple of weeks ago. I have 3 fabulous daughters. My oldest daughter had twin baby girls about 3 years ago. My youngest daughter just had twins this week, so which is really kind of cool. And my middle daughter, it's a great situation. Anyway, so from a family standpoint, I have a life outside of this. I served in the Navy. I went to the University of Rhode Island. I have a crazy hobby. I'm into antique phonographs. Edison early wind-up phonographs. So anybody here who wants to talk phonographs, come see me. That's really why I'm in Barcelona today. So in patient advocacy, I'm involved in several advocacy groups. I'm being treated at Dana-Farber, and they do some fundraising efforts, and I do a lot with the Boston Red Sox and TV and stuff like that. Professional advocacy, I'm a member of AACR. Typically, patients don't belong to AACR or ASCO or the Drug Information Association or the National Organization of Rare Disease. But I think being involved in these organizations that have advocacy and education programs has been helpful. Legislative advocacy, there's a really crying need for update on laws concerning this technology. The United States, as you know, is going through a major healthcare identity crisis. We're really trying to change. We're trying to do this better. There's a lot about the system that really works well. You know, it's uniquely American. We love to complain about what's bad. We don't talk about what's good. But I always like to remind my European audience that what you see and hear in the press, a lot of it is very emotional. What I see and hear when I'm sitting in the infusion chair is I see a lot of fellow Europeans sitting next to me. And it makes me ask the question, what is the disconnect here? So we need to kind of get the story, and I think bridging, learning from each other is one way of helping that. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the real world. So the first thing is this riding on a roller coaster. That's really the feeling that most people who are told they have blood cancer. It's mostly good days, some not so good days. There's emotional highs and lows. The uncertainty and clarity comes and goes. So I became an ePatient, again, thinking that education was the best way to do it. This is my roller coaster ride for the technicians here who want to know, well, what kind of stuff has he been on? And the first thing is this plasmapheresis, which is a blood filtering system. And the rest of these are different types of drugs. Most of them are very targeted therapies. And then this is really what my roller coaster looks like. And I think this is important, perhaps the most important slide in this presentation, that as a patient, we should all be aware of our biomarkers. Now, I'm fortunate that in blood cancer, there's a variety of biomarkers that we look at. And I'm going to just point out a couple of them. This one at the top, I guess this isn't working here. this sort of aquamarine line, that's probably the best indicator of degree of involvement. It sort of correlates to bone marrow involvement. My bone marrow is about 80% involved, and bone marrow is like your garden that produces your red cells and your white cells and plasma cells. And so the cancer cells represented weeds, 80% weeds. Nonetheless, the bone marrow did pretty well. So these are the biomarkers that your physician normally would be looking at to see about disease progression. And part of this is how I responded to certain therapeutics. So over to the right, you'll see over here, these are days of a B-cell malignancy drug, a very popular drug called rituximab. There's another drug up here, which is enzastaurin, and you'll see that there's a modest response. Then there's a relapse when I went on to a drug called everolimus. Everolimus happens to be a popular breast cancer drug, but it's a PI3 kinase inhibitor, which is also comes into play with blood cancer. So that was a drug that we tried. And again, we're trying different approaches because we don't have a specific fix. One of the best ones was this drug here, the red line, which is a histone deacetylating drug, which basically rips apart the DNA before it goes from DNA to RNA. And the beauty of this drug is that there was an immediate response. You can see a very dramatic decline. And then I got some adverse effects. Who knew that messing with histones could affect your blood pressure? My blood pressure skyrocketed, really became very dangerous. So I had to come off of the drug. But the good news is a long period of progression-free survival. And that's what we're trying to do with these targeted therapies is buy more time so you guys can get your butt in gear and get it done, you know? That's a real key message here. So I stayed on this progression-free survival for a while and then started to relapse probably around 7 or 8 months ago. And it was a pretty dramatic increase over a short period of time. Went on to a new protocol. This is a very common drug or emerging drug coming up with myeloma called carfilzomib. And I had carfilzomib mixed with an old drug that I tried a long time ago, rituximab, and had a very scary adverse reaction, one of those ambulance ride reactions. That's something patients don't come and tell you about, what adverse reactions really are about. It's much more than what you see in the lab. You know, there are things like neuropathy that affect, you know, the nerves in your feet and blood pressure issues and that. So anyway, I went on to that drug, had the adverse reaction, had to come off of it right away. And then we looked at what was really out there. We need to get that number down. That's dangerously high. There's hyperviscosity, there's coronary issues, there's pulmonary issues when your IgM, this immunoglobulin M, when it's very high, the effects of that alone, it can be dangerous. So we wanted to get it down. The only thing that could immediately do something, we felt, was to move on to this old drug. It's an alkylytic agent called cyclophosphamide. Not too happy about that because it's not one of the targeted therapies, but it's very effective. So in looking at clinical trials, I see it not only as a research option, but as a treatment option. But I'm also realistic that if it's not playing out, we've got to get this under control. So anyway, that's kind of what the roller coaster ride. For anyone who's really interested in looking at some of the other biomarkers, these are things that I felt was important for me to keep track of how I'm progressing. My physician never graphically represented the numbers this way. So I would go to her and I'd say, hey, look, doc, what's going on? And we actually did some extrapolation. We could predict when there would be a platelet crash. We made certain predictions based on how these biomarkers behaved. And there's blood technology in here, which is kind of cool. I mean, had I known about biotech back in high school and college, this is where I would have been. I wouldn't have gone into high tech. You guys are really fortunate to be in such an exciting industry. So anyway, I would like everyone here to imagine the day that you're told you have blood cancer, okay? And the first thing I'd like you to do, put your hand right in front of your face. Right now, just everyone put your hand, you know? So this is what it's like to be told you have cancer. You know, you get up in the morning and that hand is right there in front of your face. And then over a period of time, you try to get it to move away so it doesn't dominate your thoughts, and all of a sudden it jumps back in front of your face. Somebody was talking earlier today about videoing the patient, you know, to getting informed consent. Imagine sitting there with your hand in front of your face. But anyway, this is what it's about. But as you get educated and learn more about what your options are, we gradually move the hand away. As you're sliding into a CAT scan or through some diagnostic, it moves back in front of your face. But I do believe the best way for anyone who's affected with cancer to get on with their life is to learn as much as you can about it, get the hand aside, and you know, live as well as you can for the time that you have remaining. And that's for all of us. That's a good message for everybody. So the key thing here is to move that hand away by way of education, to really engage with everyone in the business, especially your physician, and to know your biomarkers. And no matter what your disease is, find out from your physician what is the biomarker that he or she is looking at. And as a patient, you should be able to be aware of those. The best way for engaging is being aware of these biomarkers. Okay, so the situation in 2006 before cancer was all I ever took was this 81 milligrams of aspirin. That's what they ask old people to take, you know, at the age of 50 or something like that. That's to keep your heart. And then, you know, strong and healthy, good diet and exercise, good cholesterol, overall biomarkers in pretty good shape. So this is one of the, and gracefully becoming an old bastard, which is BOB. So before cancer, that's what this situation looked like. After cancer, and this is really, I don't know if you guys know this TV character, but this poor guy is Barney Fife on a popular American TV show. But it's a very scary scenario after diagnosis. The real thing is what the symptoms were. So it's a combination of numbers and symptoms, and the symptoms that I remember most vividly was the hot flash. I will never tease any women about hot flash. I've had so much experience with it. It is no fun. But anyway, these are the kinds of symptoms that often come up with this blood cancer. So treatment options, the conventional chemotherapy for this, these alkylytic agents, this chlorambucil and bendamustine, are very popular for treatment of blood cancers. Nucleoside analogs, there's a lot of history with cladribine and fludarabine. And then my concern was, what is the long-term effect on the bone marrow, the factory floor that creates our blood? So the next thing was this biologic approach, this targeted therapy. And these are the types of targeted therapies I've had. This monoclonal antibody called rituximab. I've had 2 types of proteasome inhibitors, which is a way of interfering with what's important for the development of cancer cells. An mTOR inhibitor, HDAC inhibitor, pathway inhibitors, and then there's a new one, this tyrosine kinase inhibitor that looks pretty effective that I might be moving on to. That's sort of what it looks like, and then a combination of the above. This is a treatment option to use multiple combinations. I think as we learn more about blocking these pathways, these little highways to the nucleus of the cell, we're going to learn that we have to block multiple pathways. If we block one certain route, what's the effect? Do we open up another route? So I think the combination of therapies, and for this industry, it's going to be interesting because that means more collaboration. You may have one company that does a tyrosine kinase inhibitor and another company that does an HDAC inhibitor, and these two companies have to work together. Plus, they have to work together to develop a companion diagnostic. So we're going to be forced into more collaboration going forward. So a little history lesson. I love this stuff. This is the inside of a B cell. And in the, the outside of the cell are these receptors. They're like little antennas that listen to signals. And these receptors send commands to the nucleus of the cell, which is tell the cell to either to grow or to do a natural process of dying, apoptosis, or to divide. So basically how the cell will behave gets messages from these external receptors. And this is an image I stole from Genentech. But anyway, the point of this whole idea of targeting this therapy made much more sense to me. Targeting at the molecular level rather than the cellular level just seemed conceptually to be a safer thing to do. So this, I don't know if this is going to work because this is about a 15-second video, but I think it's really cool. If we can get it to work. Come on, please work. No, it's not going to work. Anyway, you actually see how the little molecules run through, and it's sort of like the inside of a pinball machine, and unfortunately we're not going to get this to work, but it shows how the molecule, how it behaves going inside of the cell and breaking up the DNA. So how far have we come in healthcare? This is an interesting question we were talking about this morning. This is an image I thought was really cool. It comes from 1894. It's an ambulance with a horse pulling the ambulance. And what's interesting in this photo that nobody talks about is what's going on down here on the street. On the street, there's all kinds of horse manure. This is 1894. And what happened in London and in New York, the big issue that people were worried about for that ambulance was not who's in the ambulance, but the horse manure on the street. We were all worried about this incredible amount of horse manure. So we had, in 1894, the great horse manure crisis. Now this is true, you can Google this and find it, but there was a prediction that would be shutting down the streets of London and New York. We were worried about the effects of the system. There was horse manure everywhere, and we were more worried about what was going on. And while this was happening, there were a bunch of people over here working on the internal combustion engine. So all of the extrapolating forward about our healthcare industry that we're making today, a lot of those assumptions are wrong. There's people over here that happen to be in this group that are working on personalized medicine, precision medicine, and I think that's one of the reasons why I'm optimistic. We need to completely change our way of thinking. We've got to focus on the target, which in this case is the patient. We need to get away from the empirical approach that we've been using. It's served us well. I'll talk a little bit about that, and move over to what we're learning about genetics and genomics. The regulatory environment on a global basis is severely out of date. So why do I participate in clinical trials? Again, they're working on my not yet curable situation. And I'll tell you, it is not for any altruistic reason. We hear that, oh, we're doing this for the love of your fellow man and all that. I want to survive first and then do all kinds of altruistic things along the way. And I think if you sat down and chatted with a patient, you yourself would do it. You participate in a clinical trial because you believe there's going to be a positive outcome. You're not doing it for the benefit. I think that's bunch of baloney. I don't buy altruism when your life is at stake, when your first goal is to survive. And I feel like I can do all of these other altruistic things, while I'm surviving. There's an ongoing rationale, thinking about this. I felt the forward-looking odds made more sense, and I'm going to let you read the rest because I don't need to do that. But I really felt it was the best hope for a solution. Anyway, so here's some of the issues. The current distribution channel, it doesn't facilitate open communications between biopharma, the pharmaceutical industry, and the patients. All drugs, all therapeutics have to flow through a third party. So we don't have a direct engagement. We don't talk to each other. The regulatory environment really prevents open communications. We don't set up the stage that allows us to talk to each other, especially whether you're in biotech or pharmaceutical. The risk is very high. And the life sciences and biopharma industry seems to me is more risk averse now than ever before. The chances of something going sideways are pretty bad. The other thing in regulatory issues is the Healthcare Portability Act in the US, and there's many privacy and compliance issues around the world, and it encourages silence. We really don't get together because we're afraid of we're not being compliant. I sit in a room, a waiting room, with other rare blood cancer patients that fly in from wherever, and we don't talk to each other, and the doctors don't encourage us to talk to each other. So we go to social media, and that's something that is very strong. I rely very heavily on social media listening for effective information. So the financial cost for compliance is very high. Regulations have failed to keep up with the state of the art. The regulatory tax base, and this is an issue nobody likes to talk about, but in the US it's brutal. We're paying 40% taxes, pharmaceutical companies. When someone says, gee, why is pharmaceutical so much more expensive in the US than in Switzerland? Switzerland's tax base is about 16%. We have a federal and state tax base which starts at 40% and states tax on top of that. The Affordable Care Act, and again, nobody likes to talk about it because you're considered somewhat of a loony if you say anything bad about the Affordable Care Act, but we put another 2.3% excise tax on the medical industry, which is really 15% on profit. So what we secretly did was we jumped this up to 50%. So my solution to this is very simple. Why don't we do the same thing that we do with arms dealers and weapons? When we develop weapons by Boeing or GE or whatever, it's tax exempt. Well, these are weapons that we're creating for patients. Why don't we get serious and say, all right, let's stop complaining about it. If you're developing something that's going to be effective, let's not tax it at 40 or 50%. Let's tax it like we're creating some kind of a weapon. And then all of the complaining about this will go away quickly. We've seen good examples of rare diseases where we said to companies, if you develop a therapeutic for rare disease, we're only going to charge you 15%. We'll give you R&D credits. We're going to encourage the development of this. We went from 30 rare disease therapeutics to 300 over a period of 5 years. It just shows you the impact if we're serious about fixing this. I don't want to make this a political statement, but from a patient standpoint, when you're looking at realistically what's happening, these things are important. Anyway, financial toxicity is a new term that's coming to market, and this really is a key thing. In the US, we have a big distinction between pharmaceutical cost and medical cost. If I get chemotherapy and I sit in an infusion care, I'm 100%, or infusion chair, I'm 100% covered. I pay nothing because it's a medical coverage. But as we move to biologics that are very expensive, that's a pharmacy coverage. And what we did under Medicare was we said, okay, we're gonna have these tiered approaches to pharmacy coverage. If I take a pill form of a drug that's expensive, I have a co-insurance, not a co-pay. And in this case, because it's a tier 4 drug, it's a very rare, very expensive drug, my co-pay is 35%. Well, when we were thinking about percentages, we were thinking about the cost of relatively inexpensive drugs, but 35% of a $10,000 drug, and again, we like to beat up the industry because it's a pill that charges $10,000. I don't have to go into the cost of developing these drugs. The point is, there's an example of where our legislation isn't keeping up to date. So I got very active in this bill called oral chemotherapy that says whether you get chemotherapy from pill form, which is what most of us hope, or get infusion, should have the same coverage. In the US, we had 50 states that are involved in this legislative. We had to convince, I think 30 of them have been convinced so far, and then we're trying to convince the federal government to look, just make this even for everybody. Let's not fool around with deciding whether it's pharmaceutical or medical coverage. So in my specific example, this tyrosine kinase inhibitor I'm looking at, the real number is $28.13 a month. And that's not fair that you stick that to anybody, especially people like me who are an old senior now. I'm on Medicare through no fault of my own. The good news is I used to have complete coverage. The bad news is I don't. And that's why some of us kind of look back and say, well, gee, we want this global health care, but at what cost? We're not there yet. We've got a lot of catching up to do, and we're working through some of these issues. Another personal situation for me, my drugs are not FDA approved. They're not on the CMS, which is the Center for Medicare Medicaid System, or VA formulary. I've got a disability from my service in the Navy. I served 4 years, and one of the deals is that if you are injured in battle or whatever, at the time you retire, you will get pharmaceutical coverage. And I always thought, gee, that was going to happen when I turned 65. I'd have, well, no, these drugs, sorry, you're not covered. So we need to fix a lot of these things. There's a whole population, midstream population that aren't covered. As far as getting back to a key message today, patient data, we got to close the loop. I've had 7 clinical trials, never once did I get a thank you card from a CRO or anybody, you know, and it's because you can't. You would give me a thank you card if you could, but the industry doesn't allow you to do that. It's important to start with biomarkers. The key question is, how am I doing? That's what we all want to know. How am I doing? There's no better way to engage a physician and a patient than to talk about how you're doing. How's the progress? It's really important that the industry partner with patients. The whole idea of participatory data, get the data back to the patient. We're starting to make progress with these electronic medical records and healthcare record systems. I get all my biomarkers through a patient gateway. A lot of this stuff can be used in epidemiological studies. I think it's really important. But again, getting back to the physician and patient engagement, the best way is by passing data back and forth. To direct engagement, this whole question of adherence and engagement through more personalized service, both in the clinic and in the lab. There's a new development of software products. I don't want to plug any one company, but there is a company here called CRF Health that has a fabulous set of software that does a great job looking at clinical outcome assessment and patient-reported outcomes. This stuff is really going to help as far as doing a much better job engaging physicians and patients in the entire industry. We need to simplify the collection of biomarker data collection, whether it's through a mobile device, the ability to keep automatic diaries and logs in your schedules and care plan. When you're sick, it's really hard to follow a strict schedule. That's why I think having a caregiver is an absolute given. It's important. And then finally, the study or the clinical controlled trial dashboard, there should be a series of questionnaires and prompts that change as you make progress through the clinical trial. So I've got to keep on track here. I think we're doing all right. This is one way. This actually comes from a company called Cutting Edge Information. I thought it was important, like, to continue to monitor clinical trial participation and what's going on. You know, these are some of the things that they looked at when they conducted a study. Messaging, sending telephone reminders, using mobile apps. These types of technologies are all coming to this market, and I think it's going to be helpful. So what is the personalized medicine, also this precision or individualized medicine, the whole idea of using genetic and genomic information, not for just disease, but your specific disease. And again, as I said, this molecular level, pinpointing what's important that for the development of your cancer cells. Also from a physician standpoint, to predict the response to certain therapeutics and to help pick a particular effective treatment option. So, in the empirical approach, on the left side of the screen, we're showing how over the years we would try drug A. If it failed, we'd move on to drug B. That would fail, move on to drug C. We need to move away from that and move to the right side of the screen, where we look at patient population groups, and we, through genetic and genomic testing, proteomic testing or exome testing for a particular tumor, we can subgroup into population groups. So patients that belong to drug group A would receive drug group A and so forth. And I think this is a really key part of personalized medicine. Example of genetic testing, everyone here is probably familiar with this. I still think this is so cool. The idea that I can do a blood sample, look at the blood sample, look at the DNA or the software, the actual code that is in the DNA, and look for the misspelling. We've identified the misspelling of my particular blood cancer, which I think is kind of cool. We want to screen those who are most likely to succeed by isolating population groups. And then really to use information about our genes, our proteins, and environment to prevent and diagnose disease going forward. So in my particular situation, this Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, 90% of the patients that have been sampled show the prevalence of this MYD88 activity, and at a particular location, L265P, the somatic location. So we've identified where in the DNA this particular misspelling happens. And so 90% was a study that has been done a few times in the US. In Europe, the Italians and the French came up with studies. The Germans came up with a study that showed it's even higher. 95% have this, okay? So the very good news is that this particular population group, we've identified the target. The bad news is I have the CXCR4 version, which is that 5% that doesn't fall in here. So we have some work to get done. We're not there yet. Companion diagnostics, really important for the group here. The question is, who's going to pay for these companion diagnostics? It's so important. I look at and I'm not an expert on companion diagnostics at all, but I look at the reimbursement schedule. It's not a very profitable industry. This industry really needs to be better compensated for creating these companion diagnostics. The payers need to be convinced that this is something that should be routinely taken care of. We want to test the safety and efficacy long before we begin the drug. The problem is we're not realistically doing a good job selling this, and it needs to be. The question, will the government and commercial insurance providers pay for that? I think ultimately there's going to be no choice. They have to see the value of these companion diagnostics. So the call to action is really more education about clinical trials. I do believe that they are safer and more effective in many cases when we combine what we know about genetics and genomics. That is the game changer. We need to recruit from an educated patient base. We need to engage credible patients. I really think this is important. It's so important that we don't just listen to a patient population because it's a collection of patients. As I said earlier, we're no more effective or knowledgeable than the man on the street except for our experiences. And it's important that we be able to communicate effectively about those experiences. The payers need to see the value and cost savings of these new targeted therapies that are going forward. We need to update the actuarial financial assumptions about these therapies. They're so wrong. I mean, the fact that we had to battle with payers about whether oral chemotherapy made more sense than infusion. A pill that costs $10,000 sounds very expensive, but if I sit in an infusion chair and I total up the total cost and it's $50,000, and you're saying the patient should have to pay a piece of that because it's pill form, makes no sense. And if I were a payer, I'd say, well, gee, I'm happy to pay the $10,000. Rather, those knuckleheads didn't get it, and they still don't get it. We need to convince these payers. To me, I think they're becoming more mean-spirited than ever before. Sorry if there's any payers here. Regulations are definitely out of date. This whole idea of, we need to fast-track these medicines. If it was affecting you directly, you'd say, what do I have to do to shortcut this? How do I get this thing done? The whole idea of these FDA programs in the US and also in the UK, around the world, the ability to fast track any kind of development with what we know about new technology, I think is important. Bring drugs to market, especially in rare disease circles. You know, the most effective advocates are moms with children that have rare disease. You know, many of them don't survive, so it's really important that we address the issue of rare disease and move very, very fast. And the best way to do that is to get the regulatory bodies on board. It's also if I were part of this industry, I would say it's our obligation to help educate these regulators. Again, you typically will know much more about your therapeutic than somebody at some regulatory body. It's our obligation to go and educate them. It's a job I wouldn't want. I wouldn't want to be in that business where I have to rubber stamp or approve. So it's really up to the industry to go forward in a positive, cooperative venture rather than beating them up. Partner with patients, the whole idea of participatory data, we talked about that. And the call to action, again, it's important, I think, that patients in particular should support biopharma, biotech, and the life sciences industry. We can dramatically reduce the overall cost of healthcare. This precision medicine, as I said, is a game changer, and we certainly can't sustain the way we're doing remedial care today. The solution is really preventive and prognostic care. If you had some kind of disease and you went through all of this type of testing, your doctor is going to tell you the same thing that he or she said 50 years ago. You know, maintain your weight, diet, exercise, fruits and vegetables, all of this. If we took care of half of that stuff, that would make a major difference in our healthcare costs. And I can tell you, in the US, we need to take a lesson from Europe on better preventive care, taking better care of ourselves. We don't. Our food system is really a mess right now. We've got to fix that. It has a major impact on the cost of healthcare. We need to support and enable this industry. This industry does support, it creates a lot of jobs, it feeds our families, and it pays our taxes. And we tend to forget that about this industry. And that's why I say what you do is a noble venture. So how much time do I have? How are we doing here? Just about out of time. Okay. So I think I'm going to just leave it to any questions. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Okay.
Adrian Arthur, Amgen, and I've just beaten David Wright from Amgen to the microphone. Jack, that was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
It's, I think, really nice for this group to hear from your perspective. Often we feel below the tobacco industry in terms of what we do, so it's nice to see the appreciation for what we do. It reminds us how important our work is. You've been involved in a number of studies, and I wondered if you ever had the opportunity to participate in the protocol development, and what form did that take, and what did you feel that you were able to contribute at that stage of the process?
Yeah, I haven't been actively involved in a protocol, but I've raised a lot of issues about the question of adverse effects, and I really am keen to learn about the downstream effects of these targeting agents. It's really kind of neat that we can target a particular malignant cell at the molecular level, but what really is the effect of doing that? So, and we're not doing enough work in that area right now. I think in protocol development, I think that's going to become more important. But as I said, adverse effects I've been pretty vocal about. There's certain drugs that are known to be neurotoxic. And people say, oh, gee, that's neuropathy, don't worry about it. But if you have neuropathy in your feet, it's a damage of the nerve cells. And if you play golf like me and you're a hacker, it really messes your game. You can't wear high heels, those types of things. Not that I wear high heels. But, so the issue that's sort of not seen as a major adverse effect. But it is a big adverse effect. It affects your life. And that one adverse effect has affected me more than anything else. And I've had a variety of adverse effects. So what I would say is really get serious. Try to understand, what are these adverse effects? What do they really mean? They're much more than just numbers on a piece of paper. And if you put yourself in that situation of adverse effect, what's it like to be rushed to a hospital in an ambulance and think, wow, this could be it? I've had 2 of those rides. That's no fun. It scares the hell out of you. It's like pretty scary. So anyway. Another question?
Yeah, David Wright from Amgen, and Adrian, you actually did ask my question. But anyway, just a sort of slightly follow-up question. So pharma and the industry is very interested in reducing the burden on patients in clinical trials, and one of the ways that we're looking to do that is to get patient insights. You're a very, very informed e-patient. You know a lot about your disease, but I think not all patients are like that. And I'm just wondering, do you have any ideas how maybe the industry can engage with patients to get sort of a general perspective on kind of, you know, how to reduce the burden in clinical trials?
That's a great question. The first thing is, I don't think it's educating the patient. I think it's really educating the primary care physician and the general practitioner about the value of clinical trials. Only, at least in blood cancer circle, less than 5% of us participate in clinical trials because we're not aware of it. So the first thing is to get the frontline soldiers, the physicians, get them educated about the opportunities. They just don't hear about it. Their major academic centers understand that the CROs do a great job getting the information out. There's more collaborative activities on a geographic basis, but the average physician, your general practitioner or primary care physician, really is not aware of that. So I would ratchet up the education of that group pretty meaningfully. From a patient standpoint, I think over a period of time, this idea of monitoring biomarkers, whether it's using a mobile device or whatever, is going to be so important. And as I said, if you had a disease and you wanted to know, how am I doing? If you knew from your physician what those biomarkers were, he or she would appreciate it because you can feed that information back. You know, if you're told, watch out for platelet crash, well, what does that mean? How am I going to know that's going to happen? Well, if this biomarker does that, we want to be aware of it. So the patient gets more actively involved about the potential for an adverse effect. Also, reporting back immediately. Let's not wait. Right now, we don't report back until the conclusion of some phase of a clinical trial. Most of my clinical trials have been phase 1 or phase 2, but we didn't report back along the way. I mean, I reported to the healthcare provider. They knew what was going on. Again, I had access to this information because I'm somewhat of an IT nut, and I really use the patient gateway. Most patients do not use the patient gateway. They're not even aware of the type of information that they can get out of that. So I think education is, on many fronts, is going to be really helpful. Okay. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, my name is Alan Bindels from Hoffman La Roche, and I want to thank you first of all for this very inspiring talk. I think it's one of the best presentations I've seen today.
Thank you.
I also want to remind people we have actually a collaboration zone where we'll be discussing actually how to make our trials more patient-centric at 2 o'clock. So it's actually a very good introduction from you, Jack, because we're going to discuss really ideas on how to make this happen. And I wanted to hear from you. You were saying it's difficult for pharma industry to interact with patients, but how have you been interacting with pharma industry, like through advocacy groups or in discussions? I mean, how does it work for you?
Yeah, I've been fortunate, and I live in Boston, and we've got a number of biotech firms nearby and also pharmaceutical firms. And I've been fortunate, and I don't want to make this a commercial, but people have come up and said, hey, would you like to talk to our sales force? So I've been asked by some of the leading pharmaceutical firms to come and give a patient perspective and also talk to people involved in contract research, in what's going on in the lab. So to offer that patient perspective, I've been fortunate. People have said, would you come and see? So the best gig ever, and I got to tell you about this gig, was about a month ago. I was asked by Genentech to come and speak at a conference. It was really an employee give back day. They invited all of the employees and friends and families and business collaborators to this conference. It was really an outdoor party at AT&T Park. So I got on the stage and had an audience of 23,000 people. That's like getting blood cancer. I mean, that scares the hell out of you. But on the stage, there's some really famous people that my kids know about. I didn't know how famous they were, but Usher, you guys know who Usher is? I mean, so I got to hang out with Usher and have a couple of beers in the back, and then a group called Foo Fighter that used to be Kurt Cobain's group, and they were there, and they were all crazy people. And then this gal who I'm madly in love with, my wife says it's okay, Colby Calais, she's a country singer, and she was there. So that was the best gig ever, and I got to meet the CEO from Roche and also from Genentech, and got to meet some of their families. So that was kind of a cool thing. And then they said, look, just keep chipping away at us, keep trying to get in here and talk to our people. And so oftentimes, you're looked at as a patient. That's kind of dangerous. Don't talk to patients because there's a regulatory issue there. And so we're kind of looked at in a strange way. almost like Republicans or something like that here, I guess. So,
Thank you.
Professor Sue Pavitt from the University of Leeds. I asked a question this morning about patient involvement. So when Philip Hammond this morning started the discussion, he asked people to put up their hands this morning about whether they want to hear information at the end of a trial, and everyone put their hand up.
Yep.
And then when later on in the discussion, Brenda Buckley said that 60% of data isn't even used that they collect in clinical trials. And he also said that we're all patients, but when we were asked later on in the discussion how many people were giving information back to patients, there were only 4 of us that put our hands up. So if we're all patients and we've declared that we want to have information at the end of the trial, you also pointed out that you're not allowed to get that information. But there are ways around it, because we involve, in all our clinical trials, we have patients sitting around the table with us as partners, and so does Jenny Preston, who works in paediatrics. She has the children sitting around the table, not just the parents, and gets a very different perspective of what their needs are. So it is possible, if the consent process and the patient information leaflet is done better and is done more in the 21st century than it currently is being done by pharmaceutical industries, we have a great opportunity to have a box on there that says, do you want information at the end of the trial? Okay, pharmaceutical industries that are risk averse still don't want to do that, but the clinicians are allowed to give information at the end of trials, and you have some role and responsibility to ask your clinicians that are responding and providing patients into the trial to give information back. And I'm sure that would be very welcomed, wouldn't it, Jack?
Yeah, I completely agree that one of the benefits of participating in clinical trial is that I believe you're much more closely monitored. You know, you get access to these biomarkers. You have more data that's available to you because you're participating. Normally, people don't get a blood chemistry report done every couple of weeks. So I had the benefit of participating in a clinical trial, and that's why getting that data, you're absolutely right, it is from the clinician. It's not from the pharmaceutical company or a CRO or any intermediary. It's directly from the clinician. Yeah. Okay, thank you, great, thanks so much. Okay, thank you.